Perry, we're excited to have you. Perry, for all of you guys that don't know, Perry is the web manager at ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum. I have to admit people. Hold on. Jared, are you able to admit people?
I don't seem to have that permission, unfortunately.
That for next time.
Okay.
But Perry, you have over 20 years of experience, delivering web and digital media solutions. And real quick, we're going to get into that, but I know you're a cook in your spare time. So tell us, you're experimenting with a hot sauce. Tell us about the flavors you're using. Right? What are we looking at when this hot sauce hits the market?
It's funny. One of the local proprietors said, if you want to do some engagements, some testing, please feel free to set up. But yeah, right now my go-to is classic Caribbean sauce. So Scotch bonnet peppers, a little bit of vinegar. It's a carrot-based kind of sauce. It's usually got some type of fruit in it. So typically mango is sort of my go-to, and a splash of orange juice. At 300,000 Scoville units, it's nice and spicy, but it also has a lot of flavor. I've kind of moved on to trying some tests with Pekin peppers and arbol, and that local proprietor, he has a little bush in his back of chiltepin peppers. So he gave me a bunch of those to do some experimenting with, which is really exciting for me. So I'm going to be doing that tonight, actually.
That's awesome. Very cool. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure maybe you watch Hot Ones, but like the ones that are like, right, like when people are on that show, like the ones that are intolerable are the ones that are just hot and no flavor. So yeah.
The goal is spicy, but with a nice flavor to it. So
nice. Yeah, no, that's definitely good. And you don't want just straight hot. So yeah, absolutely. Cool. So right, with over 20 years of experience, so we'll get into it. We can't go through all of that experience, but tell us about your previous experience prior to ROM. Right before that, you came into ROM in April, and then you were building out this RFP. Kind of tell us about that experience and kind of maybe how that influenced your RFP.
Sure. Well, why don't I start at the sort of outset? In the early 2000s, I was working for a software company, and we were purchased by .com. So we had a number of very mature products that we had on market, and then a lot of work that needed to be done for new products. And as you can imagine, some of our older products started to stagnate, and we kept on running into these problems with usability and things of that nature. So I did some research, and I ended up finding a couple of books about FACE, Alan Cooper, and the inmates are running the asylum. So I had the opportunity to go to San Francisco for a week of training at Cooper Interactive, which I think Alan I think is now retired, but the training was fantastic. I came back, and I think 2 weeks later we got on a call. It was just 1 hour call with one of our sort of heavy users of our software, and we actually resolved the problem within the hour call. It was such a great experience, and so immediately executable that I kind of delved into that quite a bit more. And obviously working through process design and things of that nature, as you move through, you start adding new tools to your toolkits. So that was software, and of course a lot of it started becoming web-based, and I moved on to the University of Toronto, where I was managing their web, more on the content side, but also on the development from a process perspective. And I immediately saw a big difference between software and the web, and particularly websites. And what I realized is that when you're designing software, you're looking at perpetual intermediates. So individuals who use the software fairly frequently, they understand what they're using, and you don't need to continuously teach them. Whereas on a website, you're designing for perpetual beginners. Typically, people come to your site when they need something, and then they leave, and that's it. And it's very tactical. And particularly at the university, we found that was the case where I think it was over 99% of our traffic was direct from Google, and the search results were so very specific. It would be something like exam schedule 2022, and they would go to the page, read the information, and leave, and that was it. So a lot of that kind of fed into learning a little bit more about the overall process, because when you're looking at potentially any user as opposed to a very specific niche group, you need to take a different approach, and that's where some of the work that we'll be talking about later in the session came out. So developing what essentially is a framework and a process for building that out.
Cool. That's awesome. That's awesome. So with that said, I know we want to kind of set the stage even more, and we have a game to do. So I need someone from the audience, though. So does somebody want to volunteer? It's a very quick game. It takes like 20 seconds. And Perry will kind of explain it afterwards. But does somebody want to? You can raise your hand on the Google Meet. Does somebody want to volunteer for our 20-second game here? Kyle, you want to give it a try?
I mean, I guess I can.
20 seconds. 20 seconds. All right. Ready, Kyle?
Yeah.
What's 1 plus 4?
5.
What's 5 plus 2?
7.
What's 7 take away 3?
4.
Name a vegetable.
Cucumber.
Cucumber. Okay, you went off the beaten path. I did it with my wife last night, and she did it by the book, as Perry will explain. So, Perry, kind of explain the game, how this lead into
Absolutely.
lead into the content. But my wife did it correctly last night, Perry. So.
Well, there is no correct here, and it's funny. Part of pre-visualization is imagining the opposite of what you expect. So cucumber is actually at the top of my list as well. Carrot is the typical. So about 90% of people will say carrot when they go through that process, because of the carrot is essentially a prototypical vegetable. Now recency can change that. So I went grocery shopping this morning and I bought a giant cucumber. So obviously very much on my mind right now. But I can, part of this game is assessing what might happen. So in all likelihoods, most of you in the audience would have named carrot, and that's really data driven. So that's been tested over and over and over again. About 90% of people, like I said, will name carrot. I could also expect that some of you are probably Googling how many people choose carrot when they are asked this question. And I can also hypothesize that some of you tried not to think of carrot because you've played this game before. Ultimately, what's important here is not whether or not I'm right, it's that I developed a hypothesis. Part of this is, again, pre-visualization, expectation, as well as doing something and moving forward with it. So it's based in data as well as past experience. And that kind of leads us into pre-visualization.
Awesome. So can you explain, you briefly kind of went through that a little bit, but can you explain the kind of the center of pre-visualization and kind of, what you need to know, like what is in there, like how can we pre-visualize at the best of our capabilities?
Sure. Well, in this context, pre-visualization is essentially imagining and documenting a potential future state. So it brings together what you know. So things like data, psychographic research, any other inputs that you're getting or have already received, what you want to achieve. So what's your goal, or what does success look like? Do you have base requirements in the context of a website? Your collective past experience. So it's not just your past experience, but your team, other resources that you have internally. And then finally, it's taking all that and bringing it together with what can you imagine. So this can be imagined use cases, an imagined end state, or imagined functionality. There's actually a really great article that Vannevar Bush wrote. It's from 1945. It was published in The Atlantic. And it's such a great paper, and it's actually kind of a revision of an earlier paper. I'm sure some of you have read it, but he imagines technologies in the future, hypertext, personal computers, the internet, the World Wide Web, speech recognition, and even Wikipedia in this article. And of course, you can get into the question of did those technologies develop because of influences like that, or was he just prescient? And I think it's probably a little bit of both.
A little bit of both, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because I kind of went over, you sent that over and I went over the essay. And I kind of had a question based on that. It seemed like Venaver, he kind of had this, he kind of was able to do that based off current events, what was happening in the world at the time, just things that he understood. So what are some habits that you maybe utilize that help you day to day kind of remember events, retain information that may help you with your website, your rebuild, your project?
Right. I use two fairly classic techniques. One is chunking, and the other is contextualization. So for those of you that aren't familiar, chunking is just taking something large and cutting it down into smaller, more manageable bits. And contextualization is relating something that you already know with something that you need to remember or reference in the future. Those are actually pretty much the primary tools that I use. And you can see that when we get into talking about the framework and how that works, exactly that process.
That's awesome. We've talked about this a little bit. Well, why is this important? Why do we need to pre-visualize for a project?
All right. And some people with they might reference pre-visualization as I'm referring to it here differently. But essentially it is using sort of a combination of what I've already described. But ultimately the goal is to find the balance between analysis paralysis and aggressive assumption, particularly at the outset of a project. So if you can imagine my first day at ROM, quite literally my first meeting, I sit down and our chief digital officer says, so we have 4 really big projects and we also need to rebuild the website as it's on Drupal 7 and it's expiring in November, end of life. And that was April. So 6 months. So of course, immediately thinking, okay, well, we have to implement dynamic pricing and there are these other ticketing issues and as well as the Drupal rebuild. And that's a lot of work. And it's very easy in a situation like that to be paralyzed by the amount of potential work that you're looking at. And I basically sat back and said, okay, great. Let's start with the framework and start to imagine what we might want. Now, understanding this is day 1 for me at ROM. I don't know anything at ROM. I actually, funny side note, I went on my new employee tour yesterday. So that was what I did yesterday afternoon. It was really fascinating. It was great to see some of the things in the in the background that happened at a museum. But it's just been moving very, very quickly. But what often happens when somebody's presented with a large project or undertaking, it can feel really overwhelming. And what you want to do is you want to move forward. But in some cases, like I said, you end up in this spot where you feel like you don't know enough. So you just start analyzing everything. And you go into a very long process of, like I could have said, I don't know anything about ROM. So before we do anything, I'm going to have to learn about ROM. Well, that would not have worked within our timeline. We fortunately, of course, got an extension, Drupal 7 being now supported until January 2025. But at the time, 6 months, we definitely would not have had time to sit back and give me the time to learn about ROM. So that's analysis paralysis. On the other side, there's aggressive assumption. And that's okay, well, we don't have enough time to do this, so we're just going to barrel ahead and do what we think is right. And that can be problematic for, I'm sure all of you have experienced that, where you make too many assumptions, don't connect with the appropriate individuals, And when you're done, your product or the result isn't exactly in line with with what you needed. So really what pre-visualization is it's a great first step to developing a hypothesis, and it kickstarts and streamlines the rebuild process. So instead of, like I said, getting into a big analysis phase or just barreling ahead, I started building out a framework. So every website rebuild has some very similar steps that need to be taken. It pretty much happens every single time. You don't need to know anything about a specific company or institution in order to be able to start that work. So I started to develop that while concurrently working through and learning a little bit more and learning who I needed to ask as the experts in order to get the insights that we would need to build this out.
Yep.
And then, of course, finally, you got to understand this is just a starting point. It's not a conclusion. Part of the goal with developing this hypothesis is to prove or disprove it. So going back to the carrot game, right today we disproved it. So the assumption was that the response would be carrot, and ultimately ends up being cucumber. So that's great. At least we know that a certain portion of people will choose a different vegetable, and that moves us ahead because it's new information that we can use and loop back into the process. So
Absolutely.
one last note about that though, be cautious in those first stages on relying on self-reporting. There's a lot of self-reporting is biased, and at the outset of a project, you are going to get a lot of opinions. So I just want to call that out because it's often a pitfall, because if you start a base assumption on something that's either false or too heavily self-reported, you could end up going in a direction that is counterproductive.
Yeah, and I want to touch on a little bit more before we move on. What are some ways that you are able to not get stuck to your hypothesis, not attached to it, and can kind of see from that point of view?
A big part of it is you kind of have to set aside your ego. I also make a point of ensuring that as we're working through, and particularly talking to executives, that it's clear that this is a working hypothesis. I actually use those terms in our last executive presentation because it's important for everyone to understand that this is an evolving process, particularly as you're moving into insights as opposed to near the end of a project. If you're at the end of a project and it's still a hypothesis, that's problematic. But my expectation for our current rebuild is that we'll be trying to disprove this hypothesis right up until the point that we're doing user testing. And that's pretty late in the process.
Mm-hmm.
The hope is that we'll be proving and disproving minor elements as we move ahead. And getting closer to somebody said correct the other day, and I laughed at it. There is no correct in the web. It's good, better, best, but never final, and never correct. So that's a big part of it. Like, you really do need to make sure that as you're moving through, you are open to new ideas constantly. And when new information is presented to you, you really do need to be open to synthesizing that with what you have. There are times too, I'll say that it has to be factored into the scope of work. So if there are strictures placed on your project and somebody comes in and asks for something that's clearly out of scope, then you can still take the note, but it will need to be pushed out to a later build. And that's a simple conversation. It doesn't need to be a problem or something that turns into a bad experience for people. But I think it is important to draw that line, particularly when you know that something is clearly out of scope. Just be honest and keep moving forward. I
think that's for a lot of people is like, just day-to-day life, and just like learning how to say no and say it in the right way, where it's like, not to get into therapy, but my therapist is like, you can say yes and say no at the same time. It's just how you phrase it. But yeah, that's a very different conversation. So I do want to get in. You mentioned rebuild. I think this is important that we get into this, and it's kind of the next step. How do you determine whether you're doing a rebuild, redesign, or migrating? What's that determination look like for you?
Yeah. So going back to day one for me at ROM, that was exactly the first thing that we discussed, because this is a fairly simple one, but it also has probably the largest impact on your project at the outset. Can you, and here's a simple way, can you migrate? And if you can't, then you have to rebuild. That's just the simplest first step. The second one is, if you can migrate, do you want to? So in the situation right now where a lot of companies are looking at going from Drupal 7 to Drupal 10, you're talking about a technology that's 12 years old, probably has, particularly institutions, so public institutions like universities and museums, things like that, you're definitely going to see that over time, a lot of content has gotten out of date, is no longer relevant. There's all kinds of idiosyncrasies in the background that people would love to get rid of, but just stopped talking about years ago. So they're there, but perhaps nobody's mentioning them anymore simply because it's just been so long. So the question there is, do you want to migrate? Because this would be definitely a good time to rebuild. Moving from 7 to 10, stripping everything down and building back up from the ground up is a really great time. For us, the answer here was very, very simple. Just due to a technical issue, there was no way we could migrate. I would say that when I was at DrupalCon this past spring, I had an opportunity to sit down with, I think, 3 of the individuals who actually build and manage all of the migration elements for 7 to 10. And they were fantastic, so giving of their time. And we walked through and they said, if you want to know if you can migrate or not, the simplest thing to do is set up a test site and hit the big button. Just hit the migrate button. And if things work, then great. You can decide from there. But yeah, for me, even if we could have migrated, I would have recommended a rebuild, as I've had time, obviously, since April to dig in. Within a few weeks, it became clear that our site really needed a revamp. There are just too many, sort of legacy issues that have hung on, and my team actually ends up spending about 50% of their time helping people manage content as opposed to actually developing or coding new work. That's how complex the situation has gotten. So definitely a good opportunity to rebuild, but that's the very, very first step.
Gotcha. Cool. And then, so what are some of the factors, within that we should consider, right? And right, right. Drupal 7 end of life is 2025, right? There's a there's a timestamp, right? There's an end. What are some of those other factors we need to consider?
This is where you move into put your project manager hat on. Time, cost, and quality. Those are always the 3 constraints. And I worked with the project manager who used to say choose 2 because you can't have all 3. Now, a lot of people do want to manage all 3. In this particular case, for moving from 7 to 10, there is a set timeline, right? January 2025, but functionally that's December 2024. So time's kind of taken away from you. You can't push this out until 2026, and that means that you're dealing mainly with cost and quality. So you get to choose one of those 2. So the closer you get to that deadline, the more it's going to cost you. And the quality is going to continue to drop on the final product. It's the nature of any project.
No, that's, if you try to take on too many things and try to control too many variables, then things just get lost. I do want to note you kind of put in like a mental trick, right? We have D7 end of life 2025. How does that affect your team if you just tell them, hey, really it's December 2024? does that kind of make things move faster when we just, hey, it's a couple of weeks, but really when you put that on the, when you put that on the
Yeah.
plan, it makes a difference.
There, among other things, on a project like a rebuild, because it's such a long timeline. Typically, like you're usually looking at 12 to 18 months on a rebuild for a large institution. Sorry, and I should frame it that way to say for a large organization or institution, 12 to 18 months. Now, when you start talking about timelines like that, you also need to start thinking in terms of vacations, number of executives that are involved in sign off. And the higher up you go for key stakeholders, the more vacation they're going to have and the less availability they will have for you when they are working. So I know at U of T, some of the executives who've been with the university for a long time, they have 8 weeks of holidays. So if you have 3 stakeholders and they're very high level and they have 8 weeks of holidays and they're not taking them at the same time, you're losing a massive amount of time if they end up in your critical path. But back to your point about the difference between January 5th, 2025 and December 2024, it's a small change, but I would not want to be launching my site anytime after the end of November 2024. So don't put 2025 into people's minds when you're talking to them. Just, start with November as your deadline and go from there.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, it's only a matter of a few weeks, but right when the 2025 is in there, it makes people think like, oh, we're 2 years away or something, right? We're really not, right? So, absolutely. So now let's get into kind of preparing for success, right? You said, hey, we have to put on our project management hat. Now it seems like we're going to kind of transition into the building the product, which is totally different. Can you kind of explain that?
Sure. So I refer to a product as something that's matured, been out and available for use for 6 to 12 months, and you've got into a phase where you're doing small releases or patches or adding minimal new features, but essentially you've moved into sort of a maintenance mode. And that's actually the case for a lot of groups or individuals that are managing websites, particularly if you're on Drupal 7. So really what you're managing is a product. When you talk about a rebuild, I think that it's really important to immediately adjust your thinking and take a moment and sit down and actually think about it. Okay, so we're moving from a product phase to a project phase. This means that we need to talk to, as I mentioned, all of those key stakeholders. We have to do some new research. Typically, organizations will let their research on their users or segmentation lapse a little bit. Some are better than others at this, but ultimately to say there's a lot of additional work that comes in as soon as you move into sort of a project phase. And if you adjust your thinking, it'll help you down the road. So going back to the idea of multiple stakeholders, if you tell an organization, hey, we're going to be releasing a small patch with this new functionality. Do you want to get involved? Likely they're going to say, no, that's fine. That sounds great. Thanks for doing that. If you say we're rebuilding your website, every single department is going to want to get involved if they have any stake in the website. So suddenly the individuals that you need to interface with just jumped through the roof. We actually created an advisory group at ROM to assist with this. I think there's 17 individuals on the advisory group, and they represent all of the departments at ROM that have a stake in our website rebuild. And part of the reason that we did that is it would be impossible for us to, on short notice, get their time and get their feedback and provide insights to them. So that's definitely one way that you can kind of shift into that project mode. For me, I also always work with the project co-lead. These long-term projects, you're going to have bad days. You're going to have to take vacation. Some some things you're going to be very strong in and others maybe not so much. And it's always great to have a co-lead. I personally found that IT and marketing working together provides a good mix because ultimately you have disparate goals from a micro perspective, but from a macro perspective, you're both hoping for a successful website launch. And that makes for, I think, the best mix. If you can find somebody that you can trust and work with, definitely helps the process.
And to touch on that, what are some things that you look for in a co-lead, or what's a good way to identify that co-lead, right? We talked about marketing IT, but what, I guess, how have you found in the past and right now, what's a good path to finding that co-lead?
Relationship is very important. Mutual respect. I know that they feel so soft, like, and squishy, but it makes a big difference. You're going to be working very closely with this individual for at least a year, and you probably don't typically have a lot of engagement with them otherwise. I would also suggest that you look for some areas of overlap, but preferably you both bring, like I said, disparate skills to the table. So having a little bit of background in marketing would help on the IT side, and having a little bit of IT background on the marketing side would be good. So, and then from there, it's often, do you have a choice? So if you don't have a choice with who you're going to be working with, then try to make it work as best you can.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So now we've kind of built this team, right? You have a co-lead. You're really, right, you're starting to determine what this project looks like. So we're at the beginning here. And what is kind of a mindset that you have? Is it, is it beginning with kind of looking out towards the end? Like, what does, at the beginning, what does success look like? How do we want to determine that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where we go back to pre-visualization. So exactly what you just said, like what does success look like? So you want to rebuild your website. When you're done, what immediately comes to mind in your imagination? Is it helping with reputation? Is it reliable? Is it increasing your revenue? There are a number of different ways to do this, but my starting point is based on a framework as well as that end goal. So defining your success criteria, defining your key performance indicators, which are ever so slightly different, imagining use cases immediately. So starting out, back-end users. So in Drupal, you can customize how your staff use the software. So that is very key for us, particularly at ROM, where we have potentially dozens of people putting content up on the site. We also have things like the use cases for groups that we have well defined. So our marketing team has really great information on how our members interact with the website. So let's leverage that. So finding things that are available immediately so that you can start going through this visualization process, but starting with the end in mind is really key here. And if you can imagine what the end goal, the end product might look like, you can actually reverse engineer that throughout the process and plug in all the things that need to happen in order to get to that endpoint.
Gotcha.
I should actually mention something, speaking of time here, really important early in this process to define and clarify what the groups that are having a conversation about this project mean when they talk about time. I have seen so many projects go sideways simply because of a confusion about time. You've got chronological absolute time, you have duration, which is how long something takes, and then you have effort. And I've seen those used interchangeably to the horror of many project teams. So I would also suggest that you get some semantics out of the way right at the beginning.
No, that's awesome. That's great advice on just altogether kind of how we can build, a better project, especially with kind of everyone in mind, right? And just different departments and everything. So before we get into the framework, any last tips and tricks that you can kind of give to people?
Yeah. So first off, I am not a huge fan of documentation, which I'm sure Jared's laughing right now because my project charter was 45 pages and our RFP was, I think, 43. But oddly enough, the project charter and the RFP share almost 40% of content, and all of that content is actionable. So when you're starting to move down this path, start documenting. And we'll show you a framework here in a minute, but it's just one of many. But ultimately, to say as you're moving through this process and imagining things, document it, just get it organized, because all of those imagined use cases and potential futures and defining how success looks are going to be really important. And part of this is understanding your domain. So you're going to know what you know. Try to identify when you need help or new perspectives. So knowing what you don't know is really, really important, particularly as you're starting up, because if you're making too many assumptions and not getting those other perspectives, again, it can drive the project in the wrong direction. I already mentioned a number of key stakeholders and their respective seniority levels will definitely have an impact on your project timeline. So keep that in mind as you go. You are definitely going to need to engage with them. You will have sign-off periods. There will be pushback. They will be slow. It's just going to happen. So bake that into your timeline so that you know what kind of time you're looking at. And then throughout the entire project lifecycle, clarity of communication is absolutely critical. So again, going back to semantics, make sure that your pronoun references are clear. I always remember I had a computer science prof in university. Every time he used the word it, he would actually define what he meant by it. And I asked him about it once, and he said years before, when he didn't do that, students would immediately become confused about what he was talking about because the reference was lost on them. So just be clear in your communication as you're moving through, and that'll definitely help.
Awesome. Well, thank you for those. Yeah, it's really helpful in terms of like right before we're building the RFP, like how can we really visualize? How can we get other people involved? Finding the right co-lead. All those things that you shared are super helpful. But let's get into it. Let's get into building the RFP, your framework.
Sure.
So first phase you have research and discovery. What are things you're doing in this phase, and what do we need to know?
Sure. And I should call out, so if you're undertaking a project internally, like this, like a rebuild, obviously it's not an RFP, but I call it a project charter. This documentation is absolutely valid in either case, and it follows exactly the same structure. You just skip all the legal when you're not doing an RFP, because typically internally you're not going to have any type of NDAs or legal sign-offs. But research and discovery is the first step, and this is where you want to be doing surveys and interviews, gathering any data that you have currently, getting feedback from your internal stakeholder groups, if you have external stakeholder groups. If you do have capacity, time, and budget for it, you could do some focus groups if you wanted to. I'm not a huge fan of focus groups. I prefer one-on-one interviews more than focus groups, just because of the nature of the results. But and again, like I said, scraping your existing data. Ultimately, what you're trying to do here is understand what the factors that would influence your success. So what do people want? What do they need? How are they interacting with your site? What's their journey through the site typically? I use the example of students being very tactical in what they want to achieve. So they typically just use Google to find what they want. They get the thing and then they leave. So our focus as a result of that insight was to ensure that we are using an inverted pyramid approach for our content development, which leads with the most important information and detail follows lower on the pages. Because speed was important to students. They didn't want to have to dig through tons and tons of information in order to get what they needed. I should take one step back here because as part of an RFP, before you list out like your research and discovery and all these phases, one of the things you definitely want to do is define some things. So define what the problem is. So obviously for Drupal 7, it's coming to end of life. Why do you want to rebuild instead of migrate? Because obviously that's a big task. So define that. So there's purpose as well as definitions, goal. So all of that can be baked into your RFP at the top. I went so far as to actually, the description I gave you of time is pulled directly from my charter document. So I actually explained what we were referring to when we referred to time. I also took a half page to explain why we were choosing a phased approach, because when somebody says project phases and waterfall, immediately people start chirping about iterative design and agile and. So explaining that up front to sort of explain to individuals that there's still opportunity to implement agile approaches and iterative design, but ultimately there are stop points. So, and then you get into research and discovery, and that's the first step. So getting all of your data, understand your audiences, understanding what past use has been, and getting the insights from your stakeholder groups about what the future should look like.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. It's super important. It's really, you're right. You're gathering information. Everybody has a lot of input. And then let's move on to then, right, who is our audience? And how can we identify them as well? Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. Yeah. So we take that, and again, this is a process that I've sort of cherry picked other processes, built it together. It's probably very familiar to a lot of you. It's just the sort of particular subset that I've chosen. But the second step for us is developing personas and key path scenarios. There is obviously, there are some groups who still like to use personas, others that do not. I personally feel that they are absolutely essential when you have such a large group of stakeholders, because when you develop a persona, and for those of you that don't know what a persona is, it's a brief narrative that describes your prototypical user. So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but from a presentation perspective, it's about 2 very easily read paragraphs that describe an individual, tells you a little bit about their background and interests and how their day goes. So it might be like, this is Mary. Mary has 2 kids and a dog. She works part-time. Her kids are involved in soccer. She enjoys going to cultural institutions on the weekend, but often has to manage that along with the kids' sports. She uses the internet a lot. She always has her iPhone with her, and she likes to shop at Winners, Amazon online, and buys her groceries at Loblaws. There. And then you use some of that information to have conversations about whether or not you are appropriately designing your site for Mary, as an example. The key path scenarios are essentially, one example might be Mary is out shopping and she notices an ad for ROM. So she picks up her phone and tries to find the information on her phone for this advertisement. Mm-hmm. And that's basically the process there. It's a shorter phase, but it takes a fair bit of work because you need to synthesize all the data from research and discovery.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Just understanding your audience, and I think like you said, I go back to, you don't like focus groups, and I participated in a few of those in college, and I can imagine right? Just gathering that data and then like, yeah, trying to figure out like, hey, who is your correct audience and how can we, properly connect with them? So yeah, let's move on to your third, requirements definition. This is kind of like, what do we need to build? And some, what are some things you're doing in here to figure out those key components?
So this gets a little bit more specific. And I guess I should call out a lot of these steps are really about communication tools. So you're taking what you learned in previous and communicating it forward. So research and discovery, lots of information and data summarized into personas and key path scenarios, which are much more compact and easily communicated to other groups. And then you move into requirements definition. And this is where you're going to have to do some additional interviews with your stakeholders that you identified in research and discovery, as well as your subject matter experts, and finding their actual requirements. So what do they actually functionally need to be able to do? So for our team, we'll be talking to our French translation team. So how do they need to interact with Drupal? Do they need automatic messaging or updates sent to them when English content is changed? As well, you're going to find, I think, during requirements definition, whether or not you need third-party integrations. Now, obviously, in a rebuild, you're going to have a pretty good sense of that at the outset, but this is going to build on that. So as you're going through requirements, you might decide that, hey, we would like some AI assist tools. So one of the things that I've heard fairly consistently is our brand voice in our content needs to be consistent. And there are AI tools that can assist with that. So that's definitely one of the requirements. And it's, there's lots of functional, lots of technical, but the technical requirements I find often come in later phases. So this is really more about functional requirements here.
Gotcha. And then next, let's kind of move on to third-party software. This is something that I imagine there are a lot of things to consider. Can you talk to us about those?
I'm going to talk very briefly about this one because this is for among other things. This is for your security team, your whatever IT, like deep IT team is involved in your project. This is for them. They need to validate that your whatever it is that you want to use falls in line with the strictures of the organization. So do you have security concerns or security policies that will not allow any of SaaS or integrations? Are there legal documents that need to be reviewed as a result of this? So I suggest that the third-party software security technical evaluation start as early as possible and can happen concurrently with pretty much every other portion of the project. In a 12-month project, I allocated 12 weeks for the team to be able to take the time to consider any potential integration. So I suspect it will actually take longer, but yeah, it's for others and it has to happen, but it happens kind of in parallel.
Gotcha. And then next, let's get into the design framework, this is kind of the how, right? How are we going to build this? Which I imagine is, a process that is based off of kind of review of the hypothesis. Tell us about this.
Yeah, this one is a little bit. This is an area where a lot of people can get confused very, very quickly, and by that I mean not your team, but the stakeholders, any of the individuals that you need to check back with, like SMEs, on whether or not these components work for what they've described to you as needing as part of their requirement. So I actually like like I said, the component process here, as opposed to something that looks more like a wireframe. Is typically that's what I've seen done, where you say, okay, this content needs to hang together in some way on this page, and here are the components that will be there. But by the time the design team is done presenting it, it ends up looking kind of like a wireframe, and then executive typically get married to that, and they're like, or they start picking it apart. And it's not intended as a wireframe. It's just intended to describe how the functionality that you need comes together into component pieces, and where those component pieces will appear together. And I know it's that one's it's a little bit ethereal, and some teams skip it because it can cause a lot of problems. I have found that, like I said, the best balance here is really to go with components for presentation to external groups, and for the core team to have a conversation with the full design framework. And then because they will have a better understanding that you're not trying to represent UI or navigation specifically. It's more about just making sure that the team understands how this might play out and being able to test some of those assumptions.
And not having, right, people on external teams get married to something that, right, the communication part's a big part of that in terms of understanding. This is not the final product. There's still a lot of things to be changed, but that is hard when, right, somebody isn't necessarily an expert in that, right? They can just see something and that's what they see. But
yeah, absolutely.
cool. Awesome. Let's get into the sixth phase of your framework, solution recommendation. This is kind of, are we still on track? And if we're not on track, what do we do?
So I, as part of my framework development, I put this in as a specific phase, and all it is a presentation to executive. You need to have, and it's that important because this is the turning point for your project. You're taking everything that's occurred previously, all of your insights, all of the conversations, everything else, you're piecing it together and you're presenting it to executive for their sign off, so that you don't get into visual design and start to develop the actual site and the executive team come back and say, this is not what we talked about and in no way reflects what we're trying to accomplish here. So for everybody's sanity, this is very important. I would suggest, even though you're not into experience design yet, I've requested for this particular meeting that the design team provide 3 mock-ups of a potential future state based on the work, just as an adjunct to all of the other work that we would be presenting at this point. You should keep it fairly succinct. You don't want to get back into the weeds here. You've already talked to the executive team. You've already talked to their team members, their SMEs. What you want to do is just present results in a very simple way, but ensure that everyone is still following that same guidance and that something hasn't changed. Not to mention the fact that you want to remind them that you're working on this project, it's very important, and here we are looking for your feedback and direction.
I think to go back to the 5th phase where kind of the wireframes are developed, this is the part really where you can show like, hey, this is what it's starting to shape up to look like. And I think external members can kind of understand that a little bit more and see it and maybe visualize more of what it's going to look like. So I think we're getting to the point where, hey, you can kind of get married to certain things. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, that's right.
Oh, cool. All right, let's move into the 8th phase, model website development. This is kind of like, were we successful? Did we build what we set out to do?
You skipped one. So experience design.
Oh, experience design. Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Otherwise, everyone's going to be real confused.
Yeah.
So after you get sign off from the executive team, that gives you pretty much the full go ahead to actually build the visual design of the site. And this is where you get into user testing, feedback, redesigns, and retesting. You can do paper mock-ups or simple flat mock-ups or functional mock-ups, and you can do it as fast or as slow as you want. I expect that my design team will be starting their design while we're still in phase 4. I don't think that they're going to wait because they're developing ideas right now. They already have mood boards and things of that nature. So it's not like they're coming in cold on this. They'll have been part of this process throughout. So the thing that's probably going to take the most time in the experience design phase is the testing, because at this point you are going to have to start testing the design and getting that feedback, and then revising as necessary.
Awesome. So
And
now
then
move on to the eighth phase. You mentioned it, and I was like, I kind of skipped over it. But now, yeah, model website development, and this is kind of the phase of understanding if we were successful. Kind of go into that.
Yeah, and that's where you actually, that gets into the technical development, and I leave that to the experts at that point. And you're looking at all the things that you would expect in the technical build, but if you're managing the project at this point, this is where you go back through all of your previous documentation. Are we making sure that these things are integrated? I've seen lots of projects where something that was agreed to early on gets dropped when the technical build starts, just because somebody lost a page, just dropped off, and as the development team was putting it together, it just wasn't something that they saw. So this is where your role becomes much more oversight driven, just ensuring that everything that was agreed to is actually being built, and the experts make sure that it works properly. The reason I say model website development is because before you launch, particularly a large website, unless you are days away from the deadline, you need the executive to sign off before you actually make this public. And if you are, for whatever reason, right down to the wire, you'll need to have some negotiations with the executive team earlier than later to let them know it's going to be very, very close. We may need to launch without a final revision. But if you go that route, then you launch the site, and you're still going to be looking for feedback, right? So you go from model website development, check with the executive, get their sign off so that you can actually make it public. And when you launch, you're still measuring impact. So you're going back to your stakeholder groups and you're asking them, okay, based on what we talked about in phase one, have we been successful in accomplishing all those goals? So
awesome. You went into the last phase there. And I kind of want to get into what are some things that you're looking at during the launch? What are some things you're monitoring per se?
Well, first and foremost, I think I only very briefly mentioned it, but the new content development is happening all the way through here. So you want lots of eyes on the new content when you launch. You want to take a look at your analytics, obviously, to see how things are going. Ideally, you can connect back with, like I said, your stakeholder groups. It's just the nature of things that people move on from jobs. So some of the stakeholders that started the project might not be the same when you're finished the project, but trying to round back and make sure that you're getting that sort of validation that you accomplish the goal that you set out to. I would also be referencing the KPIs, the key performance indicators, but also the key success factors that you outlined at the outset. And those should be updated as you move through. And this is where I go back to that document, whether it's a charter or an RFP, actually ends up being a living document. Because as you move through, you're using it as a checklist, you're revising, and this is where you get to, one more time, check through that and make sure that everything that you said that you're going to do was accomplished. And if it wasn't, what adjustments do you need to make? Because as we all know, websites are organic and they're constantly evolving. So it's quite possible that, given the speed of AI, 12 months is like a decade in the world of AI right now. So you start a project, by the end, if you've decided to integrate anything using OpenAI or other tools, you're probably going to find that the situation has changed quite a bit. There might be additional opportunities available to you that you didn't or couldn't consider at the beginning because they just didn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great final point on AI. There's so many presentations going on. I know I was at NetCamp and there was an AI presentation there, and it's all the talk right now. So yeah, but awesome. Well, Perry, well, thank you. I mean, if you guys don't mind giving Perry a round of
Pleasure.
applause, that is just great information, great content. So
Mhm.
thank you for doing that. So I do want to share my screen real quick. Final share here. This is the only time we're sharing the screen. We will send out the PowerPoint afterwards, so you guys have everything that Perry shared, and you guys can share it with your teams as well. So let me share my screen because Jared put a little
Yeah.
thing.
If you're finally sharing your screen, it must be really important, is what
Yes,
I'm thinking.
it's really important, very important. All right, let's go ahead. All right, we have the Drupal Dog. We have Q&A. Please go ahead and shoot off your questions to Perry, and I will throw on. I will be the figurative Drupal Dog here. So let me go ahead and put my dog face on. So the goal here is that Perry has to answer any questions without laughing. So go ahead. You guys can shoot your questions to Perry, and the Drupal Dog will be right here in the corner of the screen.
Watching.
Watching, yeah. But if there's no questions, we can let Perry go. But
I've got a question for you, Perry. And it's part emphasizing something you said at the beginning of the talk, just with pre-visualization, and not to gloss over the fact that most people have a hard time letting go of their hypotheses. And you mentioned ego. I think there's just something in us that has a hard time changing our minds. And I wanted to get some feedback from you on, like, if you have any recommendations, because that seems to be like a character attribute. Like, how can someone actually change that part of themselves to, I am going to laugh at Patrick's dog face. How can someone change that part of themselves, but also the team dynamic, like, even with having a co-lead, like if one co-lead believes in one hypothesis and the other one believes in another, like, how do you actually sort through that stuff without ripping up the whole vibe you have going with your team?
Right. So Jared, great question. So it's two-part. Well, one is from a personal standpoint, being confident in what you know and understanding that you can't possibly know everything. People make fun of me. I hardly use my phone for anything. So I rarely actually understand how to use it. But it's just impossible to know everything. So ultimately, if you can just acknowledge the fact that there's going to be information that you are not going to have, you can't possibly understand the breadth and depth of any organization, but also that there's opportunity in, as they say, failure, but in being wrong. You always learn something. So part of the value of hypothesis is that you're driving something. And people love to criticize. They hate to offer up something of themselves. So having a hypothesis that people can invalidate is also helpful to speed process along. Because if you say, okay, so we think it is this, and they're immediately going to say yes, or no, that's entirely wrong. You're totally wrong about that. Well, you just learned something. So I kind of put my ego down to the side because I need this to happen quickly. So I just show up to every meeting with a bunch of assumptions and I just pound through them. And the amount of forward motion that we get as a result of that is great. But yes, you have to be open to the fact that it's not likely to be correct even 50% of the time. The second part of that question was, how do you resolve a conflict? Go back to the data and validate it through the proper channels, right? So if we're talking about opinion, then you probably don't have enough data. And if you have enough data and you're still disagreeing, then probably need to talk to the SMEs because it's likely you're interpreting it incorrectly. That would be my assumption. Sometimes the biggest disagreements I think that we've had are really about recommendations. I think, and even those have been fairly minor. We're talking about, like, in some cases, we're talking about copy edit. Like, it's so minor. It's just if your co-lead, for example, can articulate why, it helps. So there have been a few cases where my co-lead has said, "Oh, don't say that, just say it this way," and he explains why. Right? Because it's language is commonly used at a museum, but not commonly used at a university. So some of those things can definitely help.
Nice. Just one thing to add to that. I think like ego and confidence are two different things, because you actually have to have confidence and a strong opinion. And I always think of Steve Jobs. Like, a lot of people might think he had like a really big ego, but I think he had the confidence, but also wasn't afraid to be told there was a better way to do something, or he wasn't afraid to fail. And just to do a shout out for Perry, when I met Perry at DrupalCon in Pittsburgh, second night we were hanging out, we went to a karaoke bar, and I was like, there's no way I'm putting my name down for that. And all of a sudden Perry's name is being called up, and he's walking up there, and there must have been like 100 people in that small room. And so yeah, hats off to you, not being afraid to do things.
A lot of fun.
Kyle, do you have a question?
Yeah, I also just wanted to add, in terms of having those difficult conversations with someone, if you have like opposing views or things like that, is like, I don't know if anyone's read Crucial Conversations. So it's like a really good book out there. My whole division, like, we all just read it together. Basically, it's kind of like a book club. So once a week we met on the chapter and discussed things about it. And so I'm sharing the link right now, but I would highly recommend, and it's like even personally as well. So like, it's great with spouses or family, or, you know, and but, you know, when you kind of ask that question about opposing views and things, it made me think of this, and this gives you a lot of really good tools on how to start conversations, how to navigate them, and make them successful. So anyway, I just wanted to share that since it's kind of fresh on my mind.
Yeah.
But,
I'll add that to my reading list.
Oh, yeah.
really good. It's really good. Yeah.
I think it goes into the content really well. Yeah.
I think too, Kyle, that I think it's great that your team is doing that together, because you have a common language reference. Like, you know, ultimately you're developing a vocabulary that you can speak to each other with, and know that everyone else is going to understand that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, so they talk about in there a shared pool of meaning. So it's like, you know, you're trying to all get on the same page before you start something crucial. And what they consider a crucial conversation is stakes are high and emotions are strong about it as well. And then you have different opinions. So kind of this triangle, if those three things are all kind of true about a conversation, then it's considered a crucial conversation. And it talks a lot about like you know, fight or flight mode. So your mind goes into that when you get really emotional about something, and you kind of do one of two things. You go silent and don't say anything, which can be really bad, or you can get very defensive and abrasive, and, you know, so it's just kind of, it's really cool. It's about giving yourself tools, getting everyone in that shared pool of meaning. And so, yeah, when we read it together, now we're all conscious of this. And so when, you know, say there's inter-department crucial conversations, we're already on the same page because we're thinking in the same line, you know, with this book. So
That's great. I'm definitely stealing that idea. That is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. That's awesome, Kyle. Yeah. I'm definitely going to
I love the dog, Patrick. I love the dog.
Yeah.
Any other questions for me?
Follows everything you do. So, like, my ears, like, moving my head right now. I mean, it just
where I was breaking up a little bit was the dog does this thing where it'll like, it's almost like it's a cat drinking milk or something. It'll go like,
that was actually me doing my tongue. I was actually going like,
oh
that.
yeah.
Yeah. That was actually me moving my tongue. So it follows. It follows everything. It's great.
Yeah.
It's great. It's great. But if you guys are going to DrupalCon this year, me and Jared talked about having a dog as like a mascot. So if you guys want to put on a dog costume, like I will do it, but like feel free, we'll take volunteers too. So droppy do or something.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Any other
one more question? Yeah.
Yeah. If you guys need to hop, you can hop too. But yeah.
I was just going to say I have I'll save this Word and kind of take out a few personal things, but or a Word doc. But we have like a breakdown of questions we can ask for each chapter of the book and our discussions and our meetings weekly. So I don't know if y'all want to reach out, and if you want a copy of that, just let me know. I'll send it to you. I'm on the LinkedIn group if you just want to send me a message through there, or you can get my email or contact info from Patrick if you'd like. So.
That's awesome. Thank you, Kyle.
Great.
All right, guys. If there's nothing else, well, everyone can. Oh, we do have another question. Saruba, I apologize if I said that wrong. Go ahead.
Yes. So not a question, but yeah, I really want to convey my thanks and my appreciation. You all taking time, you and Perry taking the time to share this informative knowledge. I've been that the deadline was on the first month of next year, and we were thinking we have one whole year, but then we realized that last 1 month or 2 months are consumed by fixing, and actually we do not have 12 months, but already 7 months or 8 months, so that we can complete our feature development or website development. And then there will always be bugs, so we need to be prepared for those. And when Perry was talking about his experience and sharing the knowledge, I went back to those days.
Yeah, it's a big process, and I hope have you got a plan?
My plan is always tell the team that we have lesser timeline. Like we have say if as a company we get 12 months, tell the team that we only have 8 months. And in my experience, 8 months will pass by, and they will always need some more time to fix the bugs or complete the feature. So
yeah, it's always good to bake that in.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Saruba, I hope I'm saying it right, Saruba, but thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for this session. Really very informative.
No problem. Yeah, we hope you join next month as well. So yeah, thank you so much.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right, guys. All right. Well, everyone will have a great rest of the year. I will take off the dog here now. Yeah, thank you guys for joining. Yeah, we're gonna look out for the PowerPoint and information. Well, we have a tight turnaround to January with Christmas, so look out for information on next month.
Have a good Christmas, everyone.
Thank you guys.
Thanks for having me all. Take care.
Thanks so much, Perry.
Bye-bye. Good day to you all.